So, good evening. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Quentin Kopp and I'm acting chair and always events organizer. Just a few housekeeping things before we get into Les Hurst's talk on George Orwell and the logical point of view. Firstly, we're recording the meeting, so if anybody's shy, doesn't want the CIA chasing them or for other reasons, you can turn your screen off. Please keep yourself on mute until we get to the end, when you will need to let me know if you'd like to ask a question. Les will be presenting slides, so the majority of your screen will be Les's slides once he gets going. If you want to ask questions at the end, please raise your hand and I will try and answer you in the order that I see you. Les will talk for about 40-45 minutes and we'll take questions. We're scheduled to finish at 7 o'clock-ish our UK time. If anybody wants to stay on board after that, when we've finished the recording part, Les is happy to stay and talk and answer any more questions after that. Les has been a committee member from relatively early on. He is a polymath extraordinaire and one of the leading authorities on Orwell, among many other things. Les, over to you.
Thank you very much, Quentin. I'm going to try and share my screen so that you can see my slides. Can everyone see my title screen?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. Since I designed this talk, I've given it the much more decorous title of "A Flower Does Not Become Less Wonderful," which you'll see there from the screen is a quotation, and I've kept the subtitle "Science, Logic and Orwell." There's a distinction between science and logic, but I believe that they're very closely connected, and I believe that Orwell found them to be closely connected too. I gave a version of this talk last summer when we had a joint meeting of the Orwell Society and the H.G. Wells Society, in which I argued, as I believe that Orwell had argued, that Wells was not as logical or even as scientific a thinker as is sometimes claimed. But this means that as I go through my talk, what you'll actually find is that I drift into Wells and out again, coming back to Orwell. My talk is going to be in a number of points. And I began my talk to the Orwell Society by comparing the opening lines of two wartime books. The Lion and the Unicorn by Orwell in 1941. As I write, highly civilized human beings are flying overhead, trying to kill me. With the opening of Wells's book, Crooks and Sata in 1943, Why Do We Not Bomb Rome? It did seem to me to mark a remarkable difference between the thinking of the two men, although possibly it reflects the state of Wells, who claimed a year later that his mind was at the end of its tether. If we were to read, as Orwell probably had done, in fact he mentions it, the 2 volumes of H.G. Wells' Experiment in Autobiography, we'd find that there's a significant name missing from it, which was William Whewell. William Whewell was a 19th century Cambridge academic, important for 2 things: the definition of inductive reasoning, which I believe is central to Orwell's thought, and his coining of the word scientist. Actually, there's a third I've discovered since I wrote this. He's one of the few Victorian scientists who'd been down a mine, which makes another connection with Orwell. H.G. Wells rejected the word scientist. In these 700-800 pages, the word occurs only once, and that's to describe a tutor he disliked. Wells preferred the older term, man of science. In his obituary of Wells, published in the Manchester Evening News, and earlier in his review of Wells's book 42 to 44, Orwell pointed out that frequently Wells relied on magic or miracles for future change, or even never explained what had happened between the two. I'm going to make an argument, and then I'm going to qualify it, that Orwell's concern with science, although it existed before 1939, his logical thinking particularly developed during the Second World War. There was rarely any continuity from week to week in Orwell's as I please subjects, but in 1945, Orwell had begun to expand his logical analysis of the world, unusually, but most clearly, in 2 consecutive as I please columns, You and the Atom Bomb and What is Science? Orwell used J. Stuart Cook's letter as the starting point to answer the question, what is science? In one of his longest As I Please article, he explains in phrases that seem taken from a dictionary that science is generally taken as meaning either A, the exact sciences such as chemistry, physics, etc., or B, a method of thought which obtains verifiable results by reasoning observed from logically from observed fact. The drawback, though, was if you ask any scientist, or indeed almost any educated person, what is science, you're likely to get an answer approximating to B. In everyday life, however, both in speaking and in writing, when people say science, they mean A. In fact, point B is very close to Whewell's definition of inductive reasoning. And Orwell goes on to say, consequently, this confusion of meaning, which is partly deliberate, has in it a great danger. Implied in the demand for more scientific education is the claim that if one has been scientifically trained, one's approach to all subjects will be more intelligent than if one had had no such training. Towards the end of What is Science, Orwell wrote, let's see if I've got this. The idea that science means a way of looking at the world and not simply a bottle of knowledge is in practice strongly resisted. Despite this possible resistance among his readers, a year later he developed his argument in his As I Please refutation of the flat earth theory, published in Christmas week 1946, and perhaps a very good proof that a piece of logic could be written in the first person. This 750-word article could be, for practical purposes, a pastiche of Galileo's dialogue concerning the 2 chief world systems without actually naming it. Here's Galileo. Orwell confronts flat earth man and oval earth man. In Galileo's dialogue, the confrontation was between Simplicio and Sagredo. Orwell supposes that both are open to argument and that they finally accept the points he makes so that he wins the argument and is able to prove that the earth is not flat, that it's an oval or possibly even a sphere. Nevertheless, although he's won the argument by ultimately calling on the Astronomer Royal, he concludes much the greater part of our knowledge is at this level. That is, appeals to authority, in his case, the Astronomer Royal. Orwell says it does not rest on reasoning or on experiment. And how can it be otherwise when the range of knowledge is so vast that the expert himself is an ignoramus as soon as he strays away from his own speciality? I needn't tell you that since I gave this talk in July last year, that a large part of the scientific reasoning and it has come under challenge whether it be in the current pandemic or even in the return of flat earthism. Just as Orwell was forced to confront just as Galileo was forced to confront the church, so too had Orwell repeatedly rejected the contemporary religious positions of logic, science and argument, a refutation put most strongly in his critique of C.S. Lewis and what he called in October 1944, silly, clever religion. That is, in many as I please columns of varying length over a 2-year period, Orwell expressed his strongest belief in the importance of logic over science and then of science over irrationality. In his 1946 essay, The Prevention of Literature, Orwell gave a more panoramic description of the deserts of orthodox thought. He pointed out, as you can see on the screen, prose literature almost disappeared during the only age of faith that Europe has ever enjoyed. Throughout the whole of the Middle Ages, there was almost no imaginative prose literature and very little in the way of historical writing. And the intellectual leaders of society expressed their most serious thoughts in a dead language which barely altered during 1,000 years. Orwell was very specific about mentioning Europe there, since earlier in 1944, in July, he'd read Martin Johnson's book, Art and Scientific Thought. And in his review, he'd commented on the advanced level of astronomy and mathematics in the Muslim caliphate of the same period. And he also mentioned later European outliers such as Da Vinci, who may have arrived, as you mentioned, at the heliocentric theory independently, but was prevented from speaking of it. My notes here say that back in July 2019, Boris Johnson had made comments about Islamic science as well. But Boris Johnson has said so much over time that we've all forgotten what he said at the time. Let's return to finding Orwell using logic in his discussion of H.G. Wells. Here's his review from 1940 of Film Stories by H.G. Wells, where he says, his confusion of mechanical progress with justice, liberty and common decency, the kind of mind that accepts the machine and despises the past, is supposed to be, automatically, the kind of mind that longs for a world of free and equal human beings. The same antithesis, quite false as it has turned out, runs all through Mr. Wells's work. On the one hand, the scientist, the man of the machine, offering sweetness and light. On the other, the reactionary, the romantic, the man of the past, prancing about on a horse and starting wars. It never occurred to Mr. Wells that his categories might have got mixed, that it might be the reactionary who would make the fullest use of the machine, and that the scientist might use his brains chiefly on race theory and poison gas. This is the point, of course, which Orwell would develop in 1943 in part 4 of Looking Back on the Spanish War. Part 4 being the section which deals very much with the themes Orwell developed post-war in 1984. I've underlined a couple of words there because antithesis and categories, because you'll see that Orwell is starting to use philosophical terms. Antithesis, of course, coming from dialectical reasoning, in his time best known as dialectical materialism, the Marxist theory, but itself owing an earlier debt to the work of Hegel, dialectical reasoning generally. If we look in a year later, If one looks through any book that H.G. Wells, has written in the last 40 years, one finds the same idea constantly recurring, the supposed antithesis between the man of science who is working towards a planned world state and the reactionary who is trying to restore a disorderly past. In novels, utopias, essays, films, pamphlets, the antithesis crops up, always more or less the same. On the one side, science, order, progress, internationalism, aeroplanes, steel, concrete, hygiene. On the other side, war, nationalism, religion, monarchy, peasants, Greek professors, poets, horses. Again, we see the words appearing there. He doesn't need to state the thesis, he states the antithesis, but then he makes it clear that he is opposing one against the other. He is opposing the thesis against the antithesis. Now, we've learned something in the 70 years since Orwell was writing these things. The concept of the thesis, antithesis, synthesis has perhaps been partly forgotten as Marxist theory has been lost, but it in practice is a basis of a large part of modern education, particularly in the United States, where they teach the so-called 3-paragraph essay, which is essentially based on the same concept. The paragraphs are, the first is for, it's the thesis, the second paragraph is the against, the antithesis, and the final paragraph is the conclusion or synthesis, if a synthesis can be made or drawn. It was something we were taught as the basis of our history essays at A level here in England. But if we were to go on, and we see Orwell applying his logic actually to practical purposes, the minds of all of us, and therefore the physical world, would be perceptibly different if Wells had not existed. Only just the singleness of mind, the one-sided imagination that made him seem like an inspired prophet in the Edwardian age, make him a shallow, inadequate thinker now. When Wells was young, the antithesis between science and reaction was not false. Society was ruled by narrow-minded, profoundly incurious people, predatory businessmen, dull squires, bishops, politicians who could quote Horace but had never heard of algebra. Science was faintly disreputable and religious belief obligatory. Traditionalism, stupidity, snobbishness, patriotism, superstition and love of war all seemed to be on the same side. But again, we can see that Orwell is using this term repeatedly. It's brought to mind, since I wrote these notes, thinking back to something that Stafford Cotman said about Orwell and his attendance at one of the ILP summer schools, where Cotman recalled that Orwell had given what he called a brilliant Marxist analysis, which impressed everyone present. Peter Davison and other biographers and collectors since have argued that Orwell's knowledge of Marx was not so great at the time, and therefore this is unlikely to have occurred. But given the basis that Orwell could have worked with simple dialectical reasoning rather than dialectical materialism, it makes it possible that he was already clear in this thinking of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. But even if Orwell had mastered dialectical reasoning, that would not be enough to identify him as the great thinker that he was. I want to go on and talk about extrapolation as another development of thought, and start with this quotation from Hansard. Winston Churchill told the House of Commons on October the 8th, 1940, and he knew that this would be in turn reported in the newspapers. We were told also on last Thursday week that 251 tons were thrown upon London in a single night. Tons of bombs, that is. Oh, that is to say, only a few tons less than the total dropped on the whole country throughout the last war. Now we know exactly what our casualties have been. On that particular Thursday night, 180 persons were killed in London as a result of 251 tons of bombs. That is to say, it took 1 ton of bombs to kill 3/4 of a person. Statisticians may amuse themselves by calculating that after making allowance for the working of the law of diminishing returns, through the same house being struck 2 or 3 times over, it would take 10 years at the present rate for half the houses of London to be demolished. After that, of course, progress would be much slower. And in fact, this is an aspect of statistical analysis which we in Britain are becoming much more familiar with through the More or Less programme on Radio 4, that Orwell himself was going to start to develop, and we're going to come on to. By the penultimate year of the Second World War, Orwell himself was starting to extrapolate from official figures and identifying consequences that were not obvious. In 1944, 3 months after the Nazi V1 attacks began, he had taken in the government's announcements, considered them, and then written. The most significant figures in Duncan Sanders' speech. Duncan Sanders was the Minister of Works, chairman of the War Cabinet Committee for Defence Against German Flying Bombs. Duncan Sanders' speech were those dealing with Allied countermeasures. Orwell went on to itemise the efforts and numbers required by comparing Axis efforts against the cost of Allied countermeasures, and concluded, one can only make rough calculations at this date, but it looks though the doodlebug may have a big future before it in forthcoming wars. Before writing it off as a flop, it is worth remembering that artillery scored only a partial success at the Battle of Crécy. That was 1346. Orwell may have remembered that in the final battle of the 100 Years' War, the Battle of Castillon, the French had mastered cannon, and it meant that the English were finally driven out of Europe. It's a very cold, rational position that Orwell is adopting. We know that the doodlebug or the rocket became a background item that he used in 1984. But he's also here simply considering the practicalities of ordnance. And in this, some people have found Orwell to be cold. Orwell's neutral voice had been apparent even earlier, and it showed in his discussion of air warfare and Vera Britton's bombing limitation campaign. He criticised her. A bomb kills a cross-section of the population, but not quite a representative selection, because the children and expectant mothers are usually the first to be evacuated, and some of the young men will be away in the army. Probably a disproportionately large number of bomb victims will be middle-aged. On the other hand, normal or legitimate warfare picks out and slaughters all the healthiest and bravest of the young male population. Every time a German submarine goes to the bottom, about 50 young men of fine physique and good nerves are suffocated. Again, we can see that the terms he employs, cross-section, representative selection, disproportionately, even the word normal and all, that he's here using a statistical analysis, a very cold one, to justify his argument. Orwell's tone in discussing the future role and cost of pilotless air warfare was surprisingly neutral, and even humorous in his zoom account of being under aerial attack from a V1 while at tea, which he published in July 1944. Yet his dark regard for figures continued, even carrying a surprising implication of nostalgic warmth when he wrote some months later, "I have just been rereading with great interest an old favourite book of my boyhood, The Green Curve by old Luke Oy." Orwell wrote this in 1945. If Orwell read it as a child, he probably read this edition. But it was probably a copy of the wartime reprint edition that had drawn his attention to it. Faber and Faber had published it in 1942. Orwell's article goes on to mention both the invention of the tank. Old Luke Oy was a pseudonym of General Swinton, who had at least coined the term tank during the First World War, and later fell into a row with H.G. Wells over who had invented the tank. And it also contains predictions of Orwell air warfare, though Orwell doesn't mention that they're subjects of other stories. He actually fails to describe the content of the story, The Green Curve, itself. The Green Curve can everyone see that?
Well, no. It's not very clear, Les.
No, it's a battered book, I'm afraid. It's a graph, anyway. The eponymous Green Curve is a line on a graph. The story divides between the War Office in London, who are unwilling to send supplies and reserves to a besieged outpost of empire. The alternate setting is the quartermaster's office in a besieged city. The graph, which is printed, has 4 lines, each supposedly in a different colour, indicating how long food supplies will last and who will receive them. Officers, other ranks, civilians, before starvation rules. The curve in the green line is the one which will keep the garrison alone alive on minimal rations. Orwell's warm phrase, "old favourite of my boyhood," disguises the disquiet of this title story, even while, as we've seen in his talk about air bombing, he was starting to apply its content to his own pronouncements on war. If nothing else, the story would have had echoes for Orwell the classicist, as essentially it repeats the fate of Vercingetorix and his Gaulish followers starved by Julius Caesar at the siege of Alesia in 52 BCE. Closer to home, the purpose of wartime rationing was to delay the threat of the Green Curve among the British public. The Ministry of Food, responsible for maintaining it, was the place of work of Orwell's wife, Eileen. Let's go on to consider, was Orwell influenced by scientists? Until W.J. West published Orwell the War Broadcast, it was little realised how deep was Orwell's association with some of the leading scientists in his day. But I can see that time is pressing, and I'll leave you to look again at Orwell the War Broadcasts, because I want to go back to 1941. Orwell's work in the war shows that if his scientific colleagues had an influence on him, it was because his mind was already open. He had begun his rational career independently before he began working with his scientific contributors on the Eastern Service. In the late spring of 1941, Orwell made a series of broadcasts nominally linked by the subject of literary criticism, which were reprinted in The Listener soon afterwards. Despite his nominal art or humanities subject, It's clear that Orwell's approach was widely at variance with any sense of projecting art for art's sake or insistence on personal response to a work of art. Instead, we find in his examination of Tolstoy's criticism of Shakespeare phrases such as coherent philosophy, grasp of character or probability, credibility again, consistent, and the long phrase, a good deal of this could be contradicted. While in the talk on literature and totalitarianism, we read, on the existing evidence, one must admit that these ideas have been falsified. Falsification, Orwell would have perhaps learned from his friend A.J. Ayer, had come in turn from the work of the Viennese philosopher, but Karl Popper. Clearly, though, Orwell did not believe that a logical analysis could destroy a work of art. But in his example, Tolstoy did not destroy Shakespeare, though the playwright was a confused thinker whose plays are full of improbabilities. A critic could list and challenge these improbabilities, but Orwell argued, can no more be debunked by such methods than you can destroy a flower by preaching sermons at it. The reference to a sermon may have been an intentionally planted clue that Orwell was to discuss the work of a priest in a future talk, since the following week he discussed the poem Felix Randall by the Jesuit priest Gerard Manley Hopkins. He continued the flower analogy from the week before while placing it in its wider context. Men of science can study the life process of a flower, or they can split it up into its component elements. But any scientist will tell you that a flower does not become less wonderful. It becomes more wonderful if you know all about it. Orwell's thought was still developing. Otherwise, by the standards of his What is Science article, he would have specified that the scientist was a botanist. But even so, he was using the terms of logic and applying them, if not consistently, then close to consistently. Just as key words linked one talk to another in the meanings of a poem, he has made a much larger scientific jump. For that line, the flower does not become less wonderful, it becomes more wonderful, echoes almost very closely, probably certainly, the concluding words of Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, which concludes, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being involved. I'm going to miss another note on which we can return to if we open up the conversation, and mention to you how did Orwell apply logic generally in his life? He did a very practical sampling. Here's two extracts from his London letters to Partisan Review in New York. The Christmas puddings, my clue to the shipping situation, were about the same colour as last year. Whiskey is rarer than ever, he wrote a year later in his Christmas letter, but there are more cars on the roads, so the situation, the petrol situation, may have let up a little. I can point out even more examples of where Orwell applies logic. I don't have a screen for this, but in his essay on Gulliver's Travels, he applies what's practically Aristotelian Boolean logic. Gulliver's horror of the Yahoos, together with his recognition that they are the same kind of creature as himself, contains a logical absurdity. In effect, we are told that the Yahoos are fantastically different from men, and yet are the same. Swift has overreached himself in his fury at his fellow creatures, and is shouting, "You are filthier than you are," which of course is a logical impossibility. As all of you who ever program a computer will know, A can never be not A. You can't. Orwell himself played with this impossibility, of course, in designing the mottos of the party in 1984, where impossibilities are made the same. But that is the point, that they are logical impossibilities. So to conclude, as we come up to the 45 minutes, not only did Orwell work with some of the great scientists of the 20th century when they broadcast for him on the radio, on the Eastern Service in that year, where he worked so closely on what has been called an early version of Radio 3 and later on has been called an early version of the Open University. One can find allusions to the work of figures from the past, including Galileo and Darwin in his writing, which indicate that he had read them probably very closely. Furthermore, these references are found not only in his works explicitly about scientific subjects, but in discussions of literature, reviews, and journalism, as references to past fiction, such as the Green Curve, when followed up, reveal. When the government published figures, Orwell helped to explicate them. When political pundits made claims about the future, Orwell subjected those claims to reason. Elsewhere, he wanted experiment. Whichever it refers to, Orwell probably had experience of it. Orwell's most important work, 1984, was nascent in his Second World War discussion of what had been made public and his ability to extrapolate from it. Following up even references to his youthful reading, though, suggests that Orwell was always building the intellectual substructure on which he would construct his final masterwork, 1984. He had acquired what he had called a method of thought. His greatness lay in his ability to apply that method to his literary constructs. He was cut short before he could give us equally great, yet different constructions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Les. Can you take the screen down, please? Good. Just a quick thing before I open it up for questions. Les mentioned the Radio 4 program, More or Less, which is hosted by a Financial Times writer called Tim Harford, who's written a very valuable book that I've just bought from Scarthin Books, set a good example to you all, called How to Make the World Add Up, 10 Rules for Thinking Differently About Numbers. It's a very interesting book to equip you to dissect some of the false news and rubbish that we have inflicted upon us these days. Very good. Who would like to ask Les the first question? Rick, would you like to unmute yourself?
There we go. Right. Very briefly, Quent, first of all, thank you very much for your introduction to Les, and that was super. But first of all, Les, may I thank you very much indeed on behalf of the Orwell Society for your talk tonight. I think we've all enjoyed it thoroughly. In fact, I know we have. I'd like to just actually, there was something that amused me for no particular reason. We were talking about antithesis. On the one hand, we have science, order, progress, etc. And on the other, we have Greek professors. I found that quite amusing. I'm not quite sure why, but it tickled me. But anyway, I must say, on behalf of the Society, thank you very much indeed for taking the trouble, and for obviously you've taken a lot of trouble to put this talk together for the Society members, and I thank you.
We have many distinguished people with us tonight, and I'm pleased to welcome you, Peter Stansky, as one of the founding members of the society. It's lovely to see you. Anybody would like to ask the next question? Chris Angel.
Les, if you could just talk a little bit more about 1984 and sort of continue on what you started, but how did Orwell take what he'd been writing about Wells and this sort of false dichotomy, let's say, this antithesis, how did he portray that in 1984? Was he putting that point of view in the party's voice, or how do you see science playing in 1984?
I think the significant point is the fact that Wells had not realized that scientists would be willing to work for non-progressive political theories. I think the important section is part 4 of looking back on the Spanish War, where Orwell points out that because society has become atomized, or nations have become atomized, scientists within them believe themselves having to work or willing to work for whatever the dominant ideology of that organization is. So Orwell points out that the scientists believe that there is only Jewish science, only Aryan science, and in turn they will adopt as their paradigm. I think paradigm is the word that Orwell never uses, and has only appeared in scientific thinking since the war. But the point is that once you have these dominant ideologies, they in turn become scientific thinking. Orwell became much more aware of this really about the time that H.G. Wells died, and the two figures who brought this home to him particularly were, or possibly even 3. Peter Davison mentions, I think, is it C.D. Darlington or C.D. Broad, who had letters which have been recently discovered. But the other 2 figures with whom he worked, one was John W. Baker. John W. Baker was present at the Penn meeting that Orwell attended, but that led to the writing of the Prevention of Literature. And Baker was a scientist at Cambridge University who was very aware of the corruptions of science under in the Soviet Union, Lysenkoism. And Orwell had obviously not only letters written to and from, but in the initial notes for 1984, there are references to a heresy called Bakerism. No, it doesn't say what Bakerism is, but we can assume, I think, that it's probably inspired by John W. Baker. The other person with whom Orwell worked, particularly on scientific talks on the Eastern Service, was the biologist C.H. Waddington. This is a book published, Waddington died in 1976. This book was finished just before he died and published just after. Quentin mentioned Tim Hartford's book. This book, I think, made just as much an impression when it came out. Now, during World War II, Waddington, who was a biologist, was actually assigned to work with Coastal Command on what was then the developing theory of scientific area of operational research. And he specifically was employed to identify statistically the best method of Coastal Command attacking Nazi U-boats. Essentially, he says in the book, discussing what they did, they had to decide whether it was better to destroy and find the U-boats at sea, or whether to prevent them from launching at all in the first place. It sounds a rather obvious solution now, but it actually took quite a lot of statistical analysis to prove which one was better at the time. And we heard Orwell mentioned suddenly in the talk about Vera Brittain and bombing, that he suddenly mentions the losses of healthy men going down in U-boats. Whether this slipped out in Waddington's conversation, we can't know, but it suggests that this was in the air, and that he may have learned something from, he may have learned something very specifically about that area. But it also indicates, sort of, while he was the producer in his second year at the BBC, which is the year when he was working on scientific talks to match the curriculum of the Indian universities, that he was very clearly developing his scientific thought in the sense of his knowledge of scientific practice. And he was also developing, more specifically, areas of thought such as the statistical analysis, which he approached to the practicalities or the value of, for instance, pilotless flying bombs. But the point is, he must have also realized that in the Soviet Union and in the Nazi regime, and possibly he was even aware of what was going on in the Japanese regime, of what was known as Unit 731, which became infamous after the war, that was the one which had experimented on human subjects, of what scientists were prepared to do in support of an evil political ideology, that they would adopt and adapt their scientific thinking to its requirements.
Another question. Peter, can you unmute yourself, please?
Yep.
I'm just, maybe it's too much emphasis on the personal, but I wondered to what degree it seems to me there was a sort of fascinating relationship between Orwell and Wells. I mean, his great early, when he was a schoolboy, where he loved, if I remember correctly, reading Wells under the blankets, and his great admiration for Wells. And then later there's sort of antagonism, and I guess the infamous dinner party where I think where Wells attacked him as being a little shit or something like that.
Indeed.
To what degree do you think that personal element influenced Orwell's thinking about Wells and science and so forth? But as I say, it may be an overemphasis on the personal.
It may be. I mean, it certainly helped Orwell and prepared his thinking, and Orwell's realization that Wells did not have the answer was, well, Orwell makes the point in two places, doesn't he? The other place I didn't bring up at all is the chapter in The Road to Wigan Pier, where he attacks the future world coming of little fat men, where, you know, Wells is arguing we will become men like gods, but the fact is that we're going to live in a world where we're not going to do anything which requires strength or requires heroism, because it's all going to be done by science. I suspect that Orwell had two periods of personal shock in his life as he thought about this man who'd influenced him so strongly. Once in 1936, as he put down his thoughts in The Road to Wigan Pier, and then again, not necessarily when he wrote Hitler, Wells and the World State in 1941, but it's very clear by 1944 when he reviews the book 42 to 44, which is basically just an expression of complete contempt. And that review is written almost from a personal point of view, They had nothing left in common. So they had thrown each other off, but presumably other people were making similar points. You've only got to think of the French existentialists who became communists, who had to reject Heidegger and the Nazi sympathizers who had some background. Thank you.
Did you want to ask a question, David?
I don't mind asking one.
Please.
On you, David.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
Thank
I'll
you,
come
question.
back to you in a minute, Richard.
Okay, no problem.
Yes. Just harking back to my reading of H.G. Wells as a late teenager, Les. I mean, there was this concept of Wells's law about sort of thinking about a scientific utopia and then building the details around that. And also he saw that Wells's drift away from religion throughout his life. And I'm kind of quite surprised that Orwell didn't attack Wells a lot more, because basically Wells was a fantasist.
Orwell, in a couple of places, mentions the fact that Wells never works things out. So titles like "The Man Who Worked Miracles" and "When the Sleeper Wakes," Orwell's criticism is that Wells never explains the method of how this change is going to happen. And it's not clear really, even in something like The Time Machine, which is supposedly a working out of evolution as these creatures develop. It's not clear that Wells has a very strong theory of evolution. But on the other hand, he had so much other invention that his writing was, in essence, it was magic in the sense of it was literary prestidigitation. You didn't notice how he was hiding the holes in his plots because so much of it, the rest of his writing was covering up for it.
Richard.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Les, I'm so pleased you mentioned that wonderful essay on Shakespeare and Tolstoy, which by chance, coincidentally, I mentioned in my latest essay, which you just put up on the website. It's a great, great essay. Supporting your view about Orwell and logic, I've just received through the post from Neil, Remembering Orwell, Wadham's brilliant book, which I should have read decades ago, of course. And he quotes Adrian Fiertz, the son of Mabel Fiertz, who says, he was always admiring of Orwell, he says, he would follow any argument or series of facts through to its logical conclusion without any attempt to twist that conclusion to fit his own preconceived ideas or prejudices or emotions. So that's page 48 of Remembering Orwell. So it's good support for your overall thesis.
A fair summary of Orwell, I'd say, Richard.
Sorry?
It's a fair summary of Orwell in many ways.
Yes, it's a fascinating quote. Anyway, Les, you mentioned all this Orwell mentioning antithesis. Could you speak a little more maybe about Orwell's engagement with Marxism?
Not a lot, because I'd recommend everyone read Philip Bound's book.
Yes, it's brilliant.
And
Yeah.
I'm afraid I'm going to leave it at that point, because it seems to me that there's a difference between Orwell's, between the concept of dialectical materialism as an aspect of Marxism, and the concept of dialectical reasoning, which is older and can be regarded as separate. And it seems to me that Orwell's thinking is dialectical reasoning, but it's not necessarily dialectical materialism. The only place where Orwell specifically says that he uses or adopts Marx's approach is not is in the introduction to the Ukrainian edition of Animal Farm, where he says, I adopted Marx's analysis and looked at things from the animal's point of view.
Yeah.
I think that's right, isn't it, Masha? Yeah, I think.
Yeah.
Can't hear what you're saying. Just wave if you agree with me.
Yeah.
Yes. Right.
Well,
So it seems to me that you don't necessarily need to think. The other place where, without quoting Marx, is when Orwell quotes Jesus, who said, "Where your money is, there shall your heart be also," which, of course, is the concept of base and superstructure, the economic base and the ideological superstructure, which I think would tie up as with the points that we've been making with Chris there, Angel there, which is that an awful lot of scientists were perfectly prepared to go along with whoever paid them, and not only in the laboratory work that they did, but in the theories with which they surrounded the work.
Can I just bring in a little bit? Can you hear me now?
yes, we can.
Yeah, just a little bit about Marx, because I don't think Orwell really went very deep into Marx. But my favorite quote about Orwell and Marx is from Eileen's letter, where she writes to somebody that they called their dog Marx before they had read the primary source, so to speak, and after they have read Marx, they felt that they were ashamed to look the dog in the eyes. So
I think that's a suitable point at which to thank everybody for coming, and for Les for giving his talk. Before we conclude the recorded bit, and by all means stay on with Les if you wish to, in 1936 he arrived in Spain under the cover of being a journalist. He was commonly known under a pseudonym, and he enlisted in the POUM and fought at the front. No, we're not talking about George Orwell, but we're talking about Harry Milton, the American who was the first to attend to Orwell when he was shot. Next month, Harry Milton's son, David, and will be in conversation with Chris Angel, talking about his experiences with Orwell. David's lucky enough to have a father that lived a bit longer than mine and Richard's, so he was able to ask him questions about all of this in a way that we never had the opportunity to. So 6 o'clock, same time, 18th of October, please join us again for another George talk, which will be Chris and David talking about Harry Milton. If you'd all like to unmute yourselves now, please can we all say thank you very much to Les in an appropriate way. So that concludes the recording part. Please stay online if you wish to continue to discuss things with Les. Thank you very much indeed.